Hello, BookTube. And here I have maybe the most difficult book I've ever reviewed on this channel that is difficult to review. The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. So this book is, now, most people are aware of like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, those works of his, The Hobbit being the prequel Lord of the Rings. Well, the Silmarillion is another prequel Lord of the Rings, but it's actually more distant. And some would argue it's not even really like a book in the traditional sense. The Silmarillion is basically a compendium of all the various mythology and the creation myth and everything of Tolkien's world. And I have very mixed feelings about this because it's hard to judge because it's something that's arguably not really a traditional book, but I feel like there's some things very critical things I have to say about it regardless. But I'll start off with some things I like about it. So the writing is beautiful. That's what he does is when he describes these mythological scenes, he uses these really cool poetic language. It really just sticks in your head. Tolkien has a deserved reputation for being a beautiful writer. The stories contained in here are epic. I think they definitely capture the spirit of real world mythology. Some of them you can tell are deliberately based on mythology. Like there's one of them I could tell was very clearly based off the myth of Orpheus. There's one scene that my favorite two scenes in this would be the battle between Fingolfin and Morgoth and the story of Beren and Luthien. I thought it was just great stories. But the main thing holding this book back is just really, sometimes just really bad editing. I'm sorry, Christopher Tolkien, that's I believe Tolkien's nephew, I believe. You didn't really do a good job. So the story, the way it works is it's not necessarily one book. Like internally speaking, it's actually a couple books compiled together, kind of like Lord of the Rings actually. But in this book, so there's like 4 or 5 different books in here. And the first 3 each have the same beginning, but they tell it in a slightly different way. So it feels really redundant when you start it again. Because the first one starts out the creation of the world, the second one is natures of the gods, and the third one, which is most of the story, and then the fourth one is the development of the third age, which is the age the Lord of the Rings takes place in. So as for the gods, it's interesting they didn't know about them, because Lord of the Rings I don't think they're mentioned at all. But they spend a long time talking about the gods and what their personalities like, what they look like, all that. They have almost no role at all in the Silmarillion. I was surprised. The gods of Middle-earth, they almost never show up or intervene in any way. It's very strange. There's a few of them. There's the gods see almost kind of there. Manwë a little bit. The creator god Ilúvatar occasionally. But for the most part, they're very seldom involved. It makes me wonder why they're included. Like there's some of them like Tolkis, for instance, who's like a warrior god. He's only mentioned once at the beginning. There's like this big cast of gods that does not need to be that big at all. They just appear very occasionally. There's also way too many names, all of them super exotic. And the problem is, it's not just enough for a person to have one name. They have to be known by several different things in different tongues. They have to be known by the elves, this by the dwarves, etc., etc. It's very strange. And now I'm having to discuss what I think is the worst thing about the Silmarillion. And it's actually something that arguably is kind of characteristic of all the Middle-earth universe. And it's not so much the quality of the book so much as a personal taste thing, but, well, let me put it this way. So Michael Moorcock, he's another famous British fantasy writer. I haven't read any of his works, but he's well known for hating Tolkien. Not as a person, he liked him in person, but he's known for hating his books. And the reason why he describes him as being fascist. And I don't think that's a fair way of describing them, because Tolkien in real life was not a fascist, but he actually makes an interesting point. He points out that the characters in Lord of the Rings are striving to serve rulers and to maintain the status quo. And the idea is rebelling against fate is not really looked on well. And at first I read that about him and I thought, oh, that's just kind of stupid. Like the Lord of the Rings isn't about that. You're fighting against a tyrannical ruler Sauron and you're trying to save the world. But then I read the Silmarillion. And to be honest with you, I actually understand where he's coming from. So the idea of the Silmarillion is that the entire world of Lord of the Rings was created by this guy named Eru, who in the Lord of the Rings world is known as Ilúvatar. And he created the world from song. And every single person is confined to his song. And if you go against his song, that is considered a very bad thing, rebelling against it in the slightest way. He never explains his reasoning for why he has things a certain way, even when it seems to bring out a lot of suffering and unnecessary conflict and inequality between peoples. He deliberately places the elves as the greatest, most beautiful people in the world, and everyone else is lesser than him. And when they try to do different things, they always wind up badly. So I don't like that. That morally, it just doesn't sit right with me. So sometimes the villains in the story are very clearly villains, but the reasons they start out being villains, they seem to make sense to the reader, and it feels like sometimes they're just forced to be evil because Tolkien has to justify the moral system that exists whereby people are punished for rebelling against the status quo. it pervades the whole Silmarillion. I don't think it's that much in Lord of the Rings. Not quite, although I haven't read it in a long time, so I'm not sure what Moorcock is referred to there. But in the Silmarillion, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it fascist. That's a bit of a loaded word, but does definitely reflect Tolkien's monarchistic values. Actually, it's like he really doesn't make any. He just makes a little bit of attempt to justify it, but not really. Like, you can't really justify why Iluvatar has this plan the way he does, and why rebelling against the plan is bad, even the plan makes no sense and just seems to contradict itself. It's very strange. Like, I can't. I mean, I can root for heroes and hate the villains, but there's always a nagging sense of doubt. That's actually my biggest problem with Silmarillion. Like, the editing, I'm definitely not a fan of. There are too many names. It's arguably more of a history book than a regular book, which is fine if that's what you're trying to do. But the moral, like, themes underpinning it are kind of unsettling. If you stop and think about it, it's hard. The fact that the villains, it feels like you could actually understand what they're doing, and not like this villain's actually relatable. He seems to be coming from it. More like maybe it's actually the so-called good guys who are really bad because they're trying to put everyone down into the system. Maybe that's a bad thing. And that's what I like the least about this. But overall, I did enjoy reading it. I think it's interesting to know about Lord of the Rings. However, it's actually strange, though. I actually thought I was reading this, I'd be like, oh, I'm going to see this a whole new insight of the Lord of the Rings world. You see, the actual age of the Lord of the Rings takes place in the Third Age. That's actually not dealt with at the very end. And it's dealt with very briefly and kind of skimmed over. And the problem is, Tolkien, he didn't really do a very good job in linking the events of the First and Second Age to the Third Age. Like, one of the biggest instances of this was, there's these jewels called the Silmarils that actually are the driving force of the story for the First Age and Second Age. And that's why it's called the Silmarillion. There are these magical jewels that everyone desires to get vets. And I was reading, I was thinking, oh, these are going to become the Rings of Power. I can tell because people have the same attitude towards them. They don't. They actually, I'm not going to spoil what happens to them, but they do not become the Rings of Power. The Rings of Power are a totally separate thing that's not even explained very adequately, like what exactly they can do or what they are. And they're just sort of thrown in at the end. Like, the Third Age has so many random things, like the wizards, for instance, like Gandalf. I thought I was going to get his whole backstory. I was going to understand more of the Istari, that is, the wizards are in Lord of the Rings world. They're dealt with, like, in a few pages. Like, you don't really get an adequate sense of, like, who Gandalf and who Saruman are, actually. They're just sort of thrown in at the end. It's almost as like he added in a bunch of stuff because he needed to make the story for it. And then there's a bunch of stuff you kind of wish was still around in Lord of the Rings. Like, for instance, a lot of people complain about Sauron being a really lame villain in Lord of the Rings. Well, you see, in the lore, he was actually the best servant of this guy called Morgoth, who was originally known as Melkor. And he was a very good villain. I mean, he's not like, again, like I said, all the villains kind of understand motivation. Like Morgoth, he wants the rule Middle-earth, but because he feels like, since he was given the most power of the other ones, he's like that you're having to serve Iluvatar. But he's a really good villain, but he's gone by the Third Age. And Sauron, his replacement, is kind of lame. Well, actually, he does a few cool things in the Third Age, but they're dealt with very quickly because the Third Age in general is kind of just like skimmed over. I was surprised at that. And then Lord of the Rings, of course, he literally doesn't physically appear at all. So I wish there was a Silmarillion equivalent where they gave just as much like time and attention to things of the Third Age as they did to the rest of it. I don't understand why it's not like that's the part that's most immediately relevant to read Lord of the Rings, not the stuff in the First and Second Age, which had a surprisingly little impact on the Third Age. Oh, another thing, and this has surprised a lot of people, the halflings, like that's the hobbits, they get like maybe a page or two. Like they don't even explain where they come from at all. Like I don't even like, are they like dwarves, elves? What are they? Like were they made by the gods? Are they separate? Like it's not really explained. There are actually a bunch of things not explained. Like for instance, it's not actually explained who Ungoliant, the Spider Queen, is. He was the mother of Shelob, who does appear in Lord of the Rings. They just say she emerged from the depths of the earth. But why? Did Iluvatar create her? Then Melkor couldn't have created her because she goes against Melkor. So why is she there? Was she part of the play? It makes no sense. There's other stuff too. There's even a sword that's a meteorite. That was actually a really cool idea, albeit it's not done with as much as it could be. And they never explain where the meteorite comes from. They don't even explain if there's other planets in the Lord of the Rings universe exactly, although they explain Iluvatar creates other worlds. But it's a weird, fantastic element, almost a sci-fi element even, and they don't do anything with it. They don't really adequately explain why it's there. Anyway, so overall, I have mixed feelings about the Silmarillion. I can't really give it more or less than 3 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I read it, but in many ways, I'm deeply disappointed by it. I was actually hoping to get more of a poetic, mythological experience. That when I read Lord of the Rings, I would get all this new subtext. And I think I will. I think I will get maybe a bit more appreciation for it when I reread Lord of the Rings again. Because I last read in elementary school, and where I read only a little bit of Silmarillion, and I was afterwards, so I never really fully appreciated mythology. But yeah, I am left kind of wanting something more out of this. So yeah, 3 out of 5 stars it is. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Make sure to please the YouTube algorithm gods by liking, commenting, subscribing. And yeah, have a nice day.